thank you very much indeed for this invitation in this very elegant setting to speak on a topic on which I'm quite inexpert. But maybe I'll be able to bring together some strands for discussion.
You have to talk pretty close to it.
Okay, can you hear me okay at the back? That's good. Right, so, and I apologise for not being here yesterday because of other commitments. So some of this, of course, may merely reiterate what you already know. But some of my understanding of the phenotype of this disorder, if I can call it that, includes the following behavioural components. Compulsive repetitive violence, obsessive beliefs, a rapid desensitization to violence, flat emotional state, separation of evidence from activity, obedience to authority, perceiving group members to be virtuous. These are quite interesting elements, with intact intellectual function. So if we assume for the moment that this syndrome shows or betrays abnormal behaviour, which I certainly think it does, it certainly fits the broad category of what psychiatrists would call antisocial personality disorder. Habitual violation of the rights of others without remorse. But of course, antisocial personality disorder comes with many nuances. There are different types. And just one distinction one can make is between, for example, conduct disorder, which we heard about this morning, and psychopathy. What is the comparison? There's a lot of overlap. We're talking psychopathy has a high heritability. Sociopathy can be acquired, so let's just leave that aside. These are otherwise similar. Two of the key possible differences here are the enormous emotional impairment of psychopathy and lack of empathy. And something else I want to raise, the distinction between reactive and instrumental aggression. So reactive aggression is aggression to threat. It's what's shown in virtually all mammalian species with a well-defined neural system, from the opossum to the cat to the rat. Aggression to fear or to pain, defensive aggression, reactive aggression, compared to predatory or instrumental aggression, where the aggression is goal-directed, as one must assume that many of these murders must be goal-directed, deliberate, intentional. In conduct disorder, the bias is to reactive aggression, in psychopathy to both, with this very important emphasis on instrumental aggression, which we don't really understand very fully in neural terms, as well as we do reactive aggression. Overall, these kind of disorders are somewhat related to something that used to be called the pseudo-psychopathic syndrome, resulting from damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the classic Phineas Gage case, if you will. And this area of the brain, these areas of the brain, as you see here in sagittal section, obviously bear circuit-type relationships with subcortical structures of importance, notably the amygdala, and also structures such as the hypothalamus and the periaqueductal grey, which together form a circuit which controls, for example, reactive aggression and probably other aspects of emotion. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence for a prefrontal amygdala axis in aggression, both in healthy and in violent individuals. And I'm not going to go through all the evidence, but here's some of the earlier data which support this view, including brain abnormalities in murderers indicated by positron emission tomography, for example. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective to this neural one by bringing in another element which I don't believe has been much discussed so far, which is a neurochemical element to this syndrome and the phenomenon of pharmacoterrorism, as recently described in this very nice article by Oliver Howes and Fond. And this does appear to be very relevant to what you're discussing at this conference. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, but eyewitnesses have described how some of the killers were zombie-like during the siege. Syringes thought to have been used by the gang before the attacks were found inside hotel rooms. The French police were investigating whether the ISIL gang launched their spree under the influence of psychoactive drug dubbed a terror potion by some commentators, which could explain the extreme barbarity of the ISIL operatives. The terror potion may be Captagon, counterfeit tablets. Now, Captagon production has been increasing in years recently, particularly in the Middle East. And according to the World Customs Organization, the amount of seizures have increased threefold in the last 2 or 3 years. So let's just consider this. We have these individuals who are taking a drug possibly to amplify or exaggerate their basic personality characteristics, or as a means to an end, to produce a syndrome which shuts off perhaps the social brain in favour of a more direct, possibly instrumental, habitual system. So just a few details about Captagon and what it is. It's essentially an amphetamine, but it also has elements of the adenosine neurotransmitter through substances like theophylline. It's a precursor of theophylline. And of course, inevitably, there are impurities in these drugs which probably make them even more lethal. Originally prescribed for ADHD in the 80s, but found to be too addictive and too dangerous given the potential for severe behavioural effects, including increased aggression and delusional syndromes. And there are studies showing that possession of Captagon is indeed associated with high frequency of assault and weapon charges. So is this correlation causal in any way? One assumes it probably is from the evidence I'm going to describe. Because methamphetamine consumers also self-report alexithymia as a result of their abuse. Alexithymia, of course, being the dysfunction of emotional awareness, social attachment, and interpersonal relationships. Instead, they are oriented towards things and even treat themselves as robots. And neurally speaking, as I'm going to show you, amphetamine abuse of this type, methamphetamine, is associated with reduced ventral inferior frontal gyrus activity, which could indicate, in theory, lower emotional regulation over structures such as the amygdala, and therefore may contribute to heightened aggression. So a very recent study from UCLA by E.D. London, I think really quite an intriguing study, has put some question marks over that precise interpretation of emotional regulation. This is one of the first objective studies of the effects of methamphetamine on aggression in abusers, published quite recently. And there are 2 or 3 components to the study. First of all, I'll point out on the right, you can see there's a competitive game, an aggressive game, and indeed the abusers do show increased aggression even in a laboratory setting. That's clear. On the left-hand side, there's an emotional matching task where you have to match the appropriate expression. And this is correlated, in fact, with an underactivity in the methamphetamine abusers of the ventral inferior frontal gyrus here, which is of interest. But also of interest is the manipulation of emotional labelling, because this is an assay for emotional regulation. If you give names to the faces, this reduces the amygdala activation and is a surrogate, if you like, of emotional regulation. This effect is similar in the methamphetamine abusers and controls. So emotional regulation does occur in these subjects, but they have an emotional deficit of alexithymia. And according to general models of aggression, if you lack emotional insight, that will produce aggression. And that may be the route by which these effects occur. And additionally, if one looks at the reduction in amygdala activity, you can see in normal subjects, self-reported aggression bears a very nice relationship. The less activity, the less aggression, not shown in the methamphetamine abusers, almost certainly because they lack emotional insight. But they do regulate, as you see here, quite steeply, the abusers and the controls. So the amygdala is regulated, but it lacks the input of emotional insight. Now, I'll answer questions. Yes? So how do I turn it back on again? I can use this one, can't I? Probably. Okay, it's working. Yeah, okay again. So neurochemically, the amphetamines work, as many of you will know, by enhancing the catecholamines, increasing dopamine in the brain, notably in the striatum and frontal lobes. But they also have an effect which is underestimated, which is on serotonin. And indeed, Kish originally discovered that methamphetamine addicts who died had large reductions of serotonin in the orbitofrontal cortex. And this evidence is supported by this PET work, as you see here, positron emission tomography, again study in Archives of General Psychiatry, showing that 5-HT transporter levels are related to methamphetamine aggression. There's highly significant correlations in the anterior cingulate, in the temporal lobe, and in the orbitofrontal cortex. So there are relationships between aggression produced by methamphetamine and these reductions of serotonin in this kind of social emotional network. Let me just back off a little bit and tell you about some laboratory work on serotonin, which I think is of interest, as I'll try and argue. So I'm sure you're all aware of the Wisconsin card salt test, which is a standard assay of cognitive flexibility in patients with frontal lobe damage. In fact, it's a very complicated test which has many components. And we simplified it for monkeys and indeed for patients by using just 2 dimensions where subjects are trained to attend to one set of symbols, for example shapes, to earn rewards, and then at some point the shapes change. And either they have to continue to learn the new shapes, or it switches to the previously irrelevant dimension, lines, for example. And that's really the basis of the Wisconsin card salt test. Another type of shift is when the affective or emotional significance of an object, the same object, actually changes during reversal learning. So a stimulus which is rewarded becomes punishing and vice versa. And we showed in monkeys quite a long time ago that these 2 forms of cognitive flexibility are governed by different frontal circuits. The lateral frontal circuit governing rule switching, for example, something which may be relevant to Kirkland's type of use of the term rule. So shapes are no longer correct, but lines are correct. Whereas the emotional reversal is more sensitive to damage to the orbitofrontal cortex. So these two types of shifting are also dissociated neurochemically. Because whereas the extra-dimensional rule shift is governed by dopamine in the lateral frontal cortex, the effective reversal is governed by serotonin in the orbitofrontal cortex, where there are very large numbers of serotonin transporters, for example. So monkeys with depletions of serotonin specifically in that area will perseverate on a previously rewarded stimulus. So their behavior is very rigid and lacks plasticity or flexibility. Now, this behavior can also be shown in the rat, the same brain systems, essentially, in the orbitofrontal cortex. And what's interesting, one uses a different paradigm with the same rules in the rat, the same different sensory modalities, but the same rules. And an interesting result is that stress really impairs reversal learning, as you see in this case. And similarly depletes serotonin in the orbitofrontal cortex of the rat. So this is another factor which I'd like to mention. Stress is a very important determinant of this, of some of these behaviors that we've been describing. And the reversal deficit is reversed completely with a drug which boosts serotonin, an SSRI, as you can see here. So serotonin clearly contributes to this rigid emotional perseveration, if I can call it that, which is governed by the orbitofrontal cortex and is one of the areas which is targeted by chronic methamphetamine abuse, which also results in a dysregulation of emotional insight. Now, these kind of results can also be seen in humans. So it's possible to manipulate serotonin in humans, not only with drugs such as the SSRIs, but also by diet. So tryptophan is a precursor of serotonin, and if left out of the diet, produces a transient reduction of serotonin in brain. And we found a long time ago that this treatment impairs selectively reversal learning in humans. So we have something which translates from rodent to human through the monkey, all to do with serotonin and rigid behavior. Now, another way of thinking about rigid behavior is the distinction between goal-directed behavior and habit behavior, which I'm sure you will have come across. And we've been studying this for quite a while in the context of addiction, but also obsessive-compulsive disorder. And we have various paradigms for isolating or diagnosing habits, if you will. So one such paradigm is a learning task where you have to learn associations between fruits on the outside of the box and reward fruits which are found in the box, for which you have to remember which button to press. Now, I'm not going to describe this in detail, but this paradigm enables you to dissociate goal-directed behavior, in other words, behavior which is controlled by the goal or outcome, versus automatic behavior, which is stimulus response. In other words, do you learn about the consequences of your actions, or do you learn about what to do when you're presented with the stimulus? And OCD patients certainly learn what to do in preference to the consequences of their actions. So do healthy volunteers with tryptophan depletion. So this is a recent study where we showed that tryptophan depletion in the assay for habits showed enhanced habit behavior, as you see here. So the devalued stimulus, which is the probe that you use to test for habits, the effect of the devaluation is reduced in tryptophan depletion. And this isn't simply a consequence of behavioural disinhibition. So just to summarise, low serotonin seems to produce rigid behaviour, perseveration, similar in some ways to OCD, and also favours habits, automatic behaviours, over goal-directed behaviours. And these are some of the other elements that you're seeing in Syndrome E, this rigidity and obsession, potentially. One can also, of course, use more sophisticated tests for social behaviour, aspects of social behaviour. And I'm sure, again, many of you, and some of you are more expert on this than I, but there are a number of economic games which can be produced to test aspects of social behaviour and moral cognition in humans. One such game is the Ultimatum game, where there are two subjects, a proposer and a receiver. The proposer offers to share something, let's say money or a cake, and the receiver, the responder, can accept the offer, in which case they both get what has been proposed, or he or she can refuse the offer if, for example, he or she feels that it's unfair. And of course this goes against some of the precepts of the economic rationality, that you will use altruistic punishment, perhaps, to control people who make very unfair offers. Well, again, without going into huge detail about the task, low tryptophan, as Molly Crockett showed, enhances the rejection of unfair offers, enhances the rejection of unfair offers, an aggressive, if you like, response. Whereas boosting serotonin, as compared to boosting noradrenaline, has completely the opposite effect and results in a decrease of altruistic punishment. In other words, you will accept the offers more happily, even if they're unfair. And this effect is exacerbated if, for example, one also stratifies the subjects by their basal empathy scores. Those with the greatest empathy show the biggest effects of citalopram. Now, this kind of effect has also been shown in this well-known moral dilemma of whether you save 5 people by sacrificing 1. And the impersonal version of this is where one simply controls points for the railway tram to be diverted. The personal, upfront and personal version is where you may push someone over to block the line to save these people working on the track. And quite remarkably, in my view, citalopram greatly increases the, if you like, the social moral decision here. In other words, to reject sacrificing the one person when you have to push them. And you can see in the personal but not the impersonal setting this significant effect, which is exacerbated in those volunteers with high empathy. Now, Molly has suggested that this is a consequence of serotonin affecting harm aversion, which must be a very important concept in Syndrome E, because they clearly do not have harm aversion. And she's followed this up in a very elegant study with Ray, who may have mentioned this morning, for all I know, where they looked at the interaction of value for money and giving shocks for self and others, and in a nutshell, showed that citalopram increased harm aversion for self and others, whereas L-DOPA did not have this effect, but it did reduce something interesting called hyper-altruism. So the dopamine and serotonin influences were quite distinct. Boosting 5-HT increases harm aversion. So you have this constellation of effects which match some of the components of the behavioural phenotype of syndrome E. Of course, that correlation doesn't imply any causal association between these, but it is intriguing, given the effects of captagon, the stimulant drug. Well, of course, the frontal circuits are very complex, and if I've already shown you, under differential neurochemical modulation, even in different sectors. And we know that another notable hypothesis, which I think Matthias Pesiglione and also probably Etienne Coquelin described, another way of thinking about this syndrome is where the rule-based system of the brain essentially turns off the moral brain or the social brain. It turns it off, it inhibits it. And one's not talking then necessarily about an underactivity or an inhibitory or regulatory effect of frontal lobe under some subcortical processes, but actually a suppressant effect of hyperactivity, which is a very different way, perhaps, of thinking about these frontal lobe functions. And I've been casting around trying to find some evidence which wouldn't be presented here probably, which may bear on this, finally, in this final part of the talk. A recent study by a Japanese group in PNAS. I think it's just online. And what they did was, intriguingly, thought about the Ultimatum game, and also a related game called the Dictator game. Now, the difference between the Ultimatum game and the Dictator game is simply that in the Dictator game, there is no negotiation or choice by the responder. The dictator decides how much he or she will give the respondent. Okay? So this is different from the Ultimatum game. And I think the insight, or this very interesting idea of this group, is that maybe one can think about the way these tests are mediated in a different way. Because obviously one way of thinking about this is that the standard way, if you like, is that in the Ultimatum game, if you're not strategic, you'll just give the respondent very little. If you're not strategic, because you're not thinking that in the future it would be a bad idea because they may get their own back on you, or something like that. If you're strategic, you'll be a bit more generous. You'll be somewhere along this line. Okay? The dictator game, it doesn't matter because you just dictate, literally, what it will be. There is no strategy. If you assume that the main goal is actually greed, to earn money as much as possible, if you assume that that is the basal instinct, and the frontal lobe intervenes, if you will, to ameliorate that greed in favour of the social instinct, if I can call it that. But the other way of thinking about things, which is something that Chris Frith, I'm sure, would resonate with, because Chris thinks the human brain's evolved for social purposes, and maybe the natural thing is to be fair. The natural thing is to be fair. And if you're strategic, you have to be strategic to be greedy, to earn the money. So it's a complete overturning of the normal assumptions underlying the neural substrates of these tasks. So actually this makes completely opposite predictions, that in the Ultimatum game, strategy doesn't come into it because fairness is everything. Whereas in the dictator game, the strategist thinks, I have to be a bit fairer because that's my natural tendency. So what the investigators then did was not a brain imaging study, although that would have been interesting, but they measured the thickness of various frontal regions and found that the thickness of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the lateral frontal cortex, was indeed related to the dictator game, as you see here, rather than the ultimatum game, in favour of the second model. So this is some evidence that maybe the dorsolateral frontal cortex, when it's more active, actually inhibits the normal social tendency, which is a complete reversal of some ideas about how this system may work. So I found this interesting and perhaps can be discussed. So basically what I'm suggesting is that we really need to understand quite a lot more about these frontal circuits and of course their subcortical connections, and maybe the degree to which they become imbalanced in some of these antisocial behaviour syndromes. There's certainly a lot of evidence of imbalance in OCD and addiction and other psychiatric conditions. I'm wondering whether this might be a profitable way of beginning to think about the problems of these complex social disorders. So finally, if I can just summarise a few issues for discussion perhaps later. Can the symptoms, if I can call them symptoms, or the characteristics of syndrome E be related to these neural and neurochemical changes? We have no evidence whatsoever on this. It's speculation, but the comparisons are of interest, and they're mediated by the drug use, in a sense. Are the changes in the brain causes or effects of the symptoms? That's always an issue. Is an R.Doc approach to be preferred to this categorization of syndrome E? Should we be focusing on concepts like instrumental aggression, which, if it's like other instrumental behavior, would involve medial frontal activity rather than damage, for example? Are there alternative approaches to understanding the prefrontal involvement, not only instrumental and reactive aggression, but rule-governed versus social behavior, and goal-directed versus rigid or habitual behavior, which is the other element which I've described? Clearly, we need enhanced scientific understanding of these belief-based representations and how they dominate cognitive and social processing. And the other question of interest for me would be, can one predict syndrome E? Are there endophenotypes for syndrome E or vulnerability which would enable one to intervene possibly and prevent this disorder? Thank you.